Hello and welcome to ChildLine's YouTube channel, where we'll be uploading any of our live footage, life lessons, episodes, storytelling videos, or any of the workshop sessions that we have conducted recently. Unfortunately, we cannot make any of the slides available to you right now, so we've decided to upload a video format of the presentation, or at least an audio recording of it, so you can get access to the information on the slides and how it was originally presented to some extent. My name is Michaela Finch, and I'm an outreach officer with ChildLine. This particular workshop, the Child Protection Awareness webinar, was originally conducted by myself and Aaron George, another outreach officer. Though this isn't done in the same live format that the original workshop was completed in, I still want to encourage you to ask questions, leave comments, or answer any of the scenarios that come up, all done in the comment section below. We want to encourage you to engage in discussion, even if you weren't part of the original workshop, it doesn't matter. Feel free to engage with the material. Now we can see a little overview of how the next set of videos are going to be structured. The first video will be on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and how that factors into child protection. And then the next two videos will cover topics 2 and 3 and so on. So first I want to start with a question. Do you think children are entitled to certain things? And yes, this may seem like a very obvious question. Most people will just say, well, yeah, I guess. But I also want to tell you to think of what do you immediately consider when you think of things that children have a right to. Off the top of your head, maybe you'll think, okay, nutrition, family, education, shelter, all of which are correct. However, for the most part, people don't tend to think, oh, they're entitled to love, affection, friendship, or emotional support. Those things aren't necessarily what you would immediately think of if somebody asks you, what is a child entitled to, right? And I want you to keep that in mind when we consider how child protection is viewed holistically. So, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child was created in 1989. World leaders came together and they made this huge historic commitment to all children of the world. They made a promise to every child to protect and fulfill their rights by adopting an international legal framework, the UN CRC or the convention. And within this convention is the singular idea that children are not just objects who belong to their parents and for whom the decisions are made, and they're also not just adults in progress. Rather, they're human beings and individuals with their own thoughts, their own rights. The convention says that childhood is separate from adulthood, and it lasts until 18. It is a special, protected time in which children should be allowed to grow, to play, to develop, learn, flourish with dignity. The convention also went on to become the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history, and it's helped transform lots of children's lives. And going back to what I said on the previous slide, notice that the law does not necessarily cater for matters relating to moral support or development. For example, while the law can force you to provide for your child physiologically, or at least it can aim to force you to provide for your child physiologically, as in food and shelter, you're not actually mandated by law to provide them with emotional support. There's no law that says that you have to love your child. The law may say you have to provide them with educational resources, you have to provide them with food and clothes and medicine. But the law doesn't say you have to hug your child and tell them that you love them and care about them. Similarly, emotional abuse and neglect, on the other hand, in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, is one example of child abuse that isn't often seen as a serious crime. Perhaps because compared to something like a black eye or a broken bone, it's not as straightforward, it's not as easy to see, and it's not as widely talked about. It's easy to see a child who's always covered in bruises and say that's wrong. But what about a child who's being told they're not good for anything? Or a child who's being told that, oh, you're just like your father, in a negative context, obviously. That's somewhat of a gray area for us. So, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UN CRC, because that is a mouthful, is a human rights treaty which sets out the civil, political, economic, social, health, and cultural rights of children. Any nation that ratifies this convention is bound to it by international law. And the convention is also a reference point for many organizations that work with and for children, including NGOs like ChildLine. It's like a guideline for us to know what to do, how to go about protecting children, what are things that they deserve to have, what are things that must be done to give them what they need. The convention has 54 articles, all covering different aspects of a child's life, setting out civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights that every single child in any part of the world is entitled to. It does not matter their ethnicity, their gender, religion, language, ability, or any other status. A child is a child is a child, right? The convention has 54 articles in total, but articles 43 to 54 are about how adults and governments must work together to make sure all children can enjoy their rights. So as you'll see in a little chart in a second, from Article 1 to 43, or to 42 rather, it covers the rights that should apply to all children regardless of where they're from. However, from 43 to 54, it tends to become a little more specific to certain circumstances. For example, it will govern how to reunite a child with their family in places of armed conflict, which does not necessarily apply to every child in the world, but it was created specific to certain circumstances. So that's why they left out of the chart, because they're not exactly relevant to our situation right now. So these are just some of the most common ones. Like I said, when you ask someone the question off the bat, these are some of the rights most people will think of, because it feels like common sense, right? They should have the right to childhood, to education, to be treated fairly, to be in good health. The right to be heard is at least obvious to me, but some people may think differently. But yes, it is considered a basic right. Right, so these highlighted in pink are 4 articles in the convention that we call the general principles. So the convention has a lot of rights, and we're not really going to expect you to sit down and memorize all of them, but a good way to build a backbone for it is to think of these general principles: the non-discrimination, best interest of the child, right to life, survival, and development, and the right to be heard. If you just think of the convention as being based on these 4 general principles, you essentially get the gist of most of the articles, if not each specific one. So this is the chart, really shortly summarizing the whole gist of each article in the convention. So the first one basically defines what a child is. It's a minor, someone who is under 18. Article 2 is one of the general principles: no discrimination. 6, life, survival, and development. They're entitled to an identity, to freedom of thought and religion, protection from violence, access to information, protection of their privacy. Yes, even children have and deserve privacy. Setting up or joining groups, sharing their thoughts freely. And the next 22 to 42, refugee children have certain rights. They have a right to be reunited with their family, protection from exploitation, rest, play, culture, arts, protection in war, and that the best law for children applies. So all of these things, you notice, fall under the 4 basic principles. So now, on to the second section of this video. Why are child rights important in the first place? Why is this necessary anyways? We bring them into the world, so it's up to us how they live in it, right? Well, not exactly. Children are individuals. Remember, they're not objects. They're not owned by their parents. Yes, you might have brought them into this world, but they didn't necessarily ask to be born. But they're here, right? So they deserve the protection of any other human being. They're neither the possessions of the parents or of the state, nor are they the mere people in the making that we might sometimes think of them as. They're not just adults in training. They have equal status as members of the human family. Children start life as totally dependent beings. They have to rely on adults for the nurturing and the guidance they need to be able to grow, hopefully, towards independence. This nurturing is ideally found from adults in the children's families, but when primary adult caregivers or parents cannot meet the child's needs, it is then up to the state as the primary duty bearer to find an alternative that is, again, in the best interest of the child. Yes, sometimes the child might love this person, might want to be with them all the time, don't want to leave this family member, but that person might be dangerous for them to be around. So it's not that the convention is about giving children what will make them happy all the time. Because again, they're children, they deserve certain things, but sometimes they can make short-sighted decisions as well. So decisions have to be made to seek their best interests. What will keep them safe? What will ensure that they have a healthy, stable future? The actions or inactions of government impact children more strongly than any other group in a society. Nearly every area of government or any kind of policy will affect children, and more so than everyone else, because the fact is they won't be able to change most of the decisions made on their behalf. Things that are done around them will still affect them. Short-sighted policy making that fails to take children into account will have a negative impact on the future of all members of society, old and young. Children's views should be heard and considered in the political process. Again, like I just mentioned, they often cannot change the decisions that adults make for them. They generally don't vote, and they are not traditionally allowed to take part in the political process. Without special attention to their opinions then, whether that's expressed at home or in the school or in your own communities, children's views will go unheard on the many important issues that will and continue to affect them. Many changes in society are having a disproportionate and often negative impact on children. And a good example relevant to right now, even though at the point of recording this, things are seeming to get a little better. COVID-19. It hit the world like a truck, right? And no matter what, there's no way we could have really predicted what was going to happen or the steps we should take to prevent certain things from happening. We just had to deal with it as it came. And in doing that, we had to shut down schools. It was a necessary step because children would be one of the more vulnerable groups should it spread amongst a school population, right? So that was a big decision we had to make, and it does not go without affecting children. Transformation of social, political, economic, and cultural structures will always have that impact on children. They suddenly can't go to school. They suddenly can't see their friends. They have to stay at home. In some cases, children being trapped at home is much more dangerous for them than going outside. It depends on the kind of environment they're exposed to at home. The healthy development of children is crucial to the future well-being of any society. Since they're still developing, children are an especially vulnerable group, even more so than adults, to poor living conditions. Things like poverty, inadequate health care, poor nutrition, unsafe water supply, lack of housing, and even environmental pollution, or the effects of disease malnutrition. All of these things affect the present life and the future of children, and therefore the future of the societies in which they live. Yes, we don't want to treat children as if they're just adults in progress, but the fact is, they will become the adults of our future as well. At some point, we're all going to get old and we're going to be at the mercy of the children that we're raising today. So we always have to think about, what are we instilling in them? What are we doing now that could be harming them physically, emotionally, psychologically? And finally, related to everything I just said, the cost to society of failing children is huge. Research shows that children's earliest experience will significantly influence their development in the future. The cost of this development determines their contribution or their cost to society over the course of their lives. Children can either add to society in a positive way, or they can take from it and harm it in the future. Right, so this is the last point in this first part of the video, of the series of videos. So the next video, we'll talk about child abuse, different forms of child abuse, how it's different from maltreatment, and how so many different things that we're culturally exposed to and accustomed to in the Caribbean might actually be early signs of abuse or encouraging abuse in some way.